Here's the thing about the mid-90s indie scene. Everybody had a label. Your cousin had a label. The guy running the local zine had a label. And somewhere in Southern California, a dude named Bob Becker was literally selling his friends' records out of the back of a car at punk shows, putting them on consignment at whatever stores would take them, and deciding, almost on a whim, to call himself a record label. The name? Fearless Records. Why Fearless? Because by Becker's own admission, he had no idea what he was doing and wasn't afraid to jump in head first. Fearless Records officially formed in 1994. Raw, scrappy, completely indistinguishable from the 50 other indie labels doing the same thing. In 1998, Becker caught a show at a bar called Club Mesa. The opening band was a 5-piece from El Paso, who played like they were simultaneously falling apart and discovering fire. He signed at the drive-in. Fearless Records in Casino out in 1998, and ATDI went on to become post-hardcore legends, eventually on a major label. Fearless had touched greatness, but greatness had moved on. So, what does a small punk label do with no flagship act and an indie scene that doesn't care if you exist? The answer, as it turned out, was completely insane. This is the story of Fearless Records. The year was 2000. Nu metal is eating everything alive. Pop punk is bubbling under the surface, and Bob Becker, instead of signing 10 more bands and hoping one popped, decided to release a compilation of punk bands covering heavy metal songs. Punk Goes Metal dropped August 1st, 2000. Weird. Gimmicky. Exactly the kind of idea that sounds better at midnight. But it worked. Not commercially. Not yet. But it proved Fearless could own a format instead of just releasing music. 2 years later, Becker pushed it further, into territory that sounded even more absurd. What if punk bands covered pop songs? Not respectable pop, Britney Spears pop, Backstreet Boys pop, the pop that punk kids sneered at publicly and hummed in the shower. Punk Goes Pop dropped April 3rd, 2002. Dynamite Boy covered I Want It That Way. Yellow Card covered Michelle Branch's Everywhere. MXPX tackled NSYNC. Rufio turned Madonna into a 3-chord sprint. The press didn't know what to make of it, but the kids who bought it loved it, because it said something almost subversive. Liking pop doesn't make you a traitor. That wall between mainstream and underground? Just a wall. You can kick it down with a guitar. Was this a one-time stunt, or was Fearless accidentally standing on something much bigger? Here's what nobody fully understood about Punk Goes Pop, including possibly the people who made it. It wasn't just a cover album, it was a bridge. A teenager who'd never heard of Rufio could pick it up because they'd recognize the Backstreet Boys song. And 2 listens later, they were buying Ocean Avenue by Yellow Card and wearing band tees to school. The compilation wasn't entertainment, it was recruitment. That's what separated it from every other indie comp in the discount bin. The hook was baked in. You weren't hearing an unknown band play an unknown song. You were hearing a band reimagine something you already knew existed, and that lowered the barrier to entry in a way that was almost unfair. These weren't songs scene kids necessarily loved. They were songs scene kids couldn't escape. Britney Spears on the radio at the mall, Backstreet Boys at every school dance. The originals were culturally unavoidable, which made them instantly recognizable. And recognition, not affection, was the real mechanism at work. Fearless had cracked something the rest of the scene hadn't articulated. An unknown band playing a familiar song is a lower risk discovery than an unknown band playing an unknown one. Swap out one variable, and suddenly the barrier drops. That formula was quietly becoming the spine of an entire label identity. But knowing what you have and knowing what to do with it are 2 different things. What came next would define whether Punk Goes was a fluke or a foundation. Between 2002 and 2010, Fearless built a machine around the Punk Goes concept and used it to develop a roster that shaped a generation. Plain White Tees, signed to Fearless, dropped All That We Needed in 2005, a record containing a quiet acoustic track called Hey There Delilah. It didn't blow up immediately, but when Hollywood Records re-released it in 2007, it hit number 1 on the Billboard Hot 100, earned 2 Grammy nominations, and went quadruple platinum. A Fearless band had a chart-topping, Grammy-nominated single. That changed what an indie punk label could claim. Then came Sugar Cult, Mayday Parade, The Maine, Breathe Carolina, all signed directly to Fearless, building out a roster anchored in melodic, emotionally direct music for kids who cared deeply and weren't embarrassed about it. Meanwhile, the series kept expanding. Punk Goes Acoustic in 2003, Punk Goes 80s in 2005, charting at number 18, Punk Goes 90s in 2006, top 200 at number 186, Punk Goes Crunk in 2008, and Punk Goes Pop Volume 2 in 2009, by which point the series was a recognized brand, charting consistently. The mechanism was elegant: appear on a compilation, convert listeners, release original material to a pre-built audience. The compilations weren't just product, they were infrastructure. But here's the thing about machines. They're visible, and once everyone can see how yours works, they start to have opinions. Punk Goes Pop Volumes 3, 4, and 5 dropped in close succession, 2010, 11, and 12. Each one charted. Volume 4 became the most streamed in the series, racking up 81 million Spotify streams, with Tonight Alive's Little Lion Man alone hitting nearly 23 million plays. The numbers were good. The criticism was getting louder anyway. The question wasn't whether the series was successful. It clearly was. It was whether Fearless was too dependent on it. Whether a label known for artistic development was starting to look like a label known for compilation format. But what did that artist development actually look like? Who are the acts Fearless built from the ground up? That part of the story hasn't been told yet, and it needs to be. The roster they cultivated, the bands they believed in before anyone else did, is a crucial chapter that goes well beyond any compilation series. By 2012, with Volume 5 on shelves, Subversive was harder to argue. The scene was shifting too. Metalcore was ascending, and the melodic pop-punk landscape that had made Fearless's run possible was changing underneath them. The thing that built them was starting to feel, to some, like a ceiling. The question wasn't whether Fearless knew this. The question was what they were going to do about it. Fearless didn't hold a press conference. They just started signing different bands. In 2014, a Michigan metalcore band called I Prevail uploaded a cover of Taylor Swift's Blank Space to YouTube. It racked up millions of views in days. Heavy, catchy, doing exactly what Punk Goes had done on CD for a decade. Bridging pop familiarity with rock energy. Fearless signed them. I Prevail's debut EP, Heart vs. Mind, sold over 60,000 copies. Their debut album, Lifelines, debuted at number 15 on the Billboard 200. This was different from Plain White T's or The Main. I Prevail were metalcore. Their signing was a signal. Pierce the Veil and Real Friends joined the roster around the same time. Post-hardcore depth alongside pop-punk heart. The Punk Goes series didn't disappear, but it stepped back from center stage. It became one part of the story instead of the whole story. They were trying to prove they were more than their most famous product, and the proof was in who they were choosing to develop. But proving you're more than your biggest idea is harder than having the idea. And just as Fearless found its new footing, the entire genre was about to do something nobody predicted. Between 2017 and 2019, Fearless expanded into territory that would have seemed unlikely a decade earlier. Ice Nine Kills, signed to the label since 2015, brought metalcore with horror movie theatrics and genuine cult-level devotion. Movements, also on the Fearless roster, brought introspective post-hardcore that felt thoughtful in a new way. Fearless was no longer a genre label. It was an aesthetic label, built around emotional intensity and the willingness to engage with the mainstream without being consumed by it. The Punk Goes DNA was still there. Punk and pop as collaborators, not enemies. It was just expressing itself in harder sounds now. The label had become genuinely adaptable, but adaptability alone doesn't explain what happened next, because that required something Fearless already had. A formula a whole new generation was suddenly ready to discover. In 2020, a pandemic. Everyone stuck inside with their feelings and their playlists. And out of that came something nobody fully anticipated. Pop-punk came back. Machine Gun Kelly's Tickets to My Downfall hit number 1 on the Billboard 200. Olivia Rodrigo's Good For You sounded like a Paramore B-side and went to number 1 on the Hot 100. TikTok was full of teenagers discovering brand new in Sum 41, building aesthetics around emotional honesty and the melodic anguish pop-punk had been perfecting since the 90s. Fearless had lived through the original wave. They'd survived being reduced to their biggest idea. And now, the genre they helped define was having a genuine cultural moment. And they were still standing. Punk Goes Pop Volume 7 arrived feeling cosmically timed. It dropped on July 14, 2017, and made waves across the rock world. The series it belongs to has since become the top-selling compilation in the alternative genre, moving over 2.5 million cumulative albums and racking up nearly 250 million streams, with Volume 7 alone pulling massive streaming numbers and earning a 4.5 out of 5-star review from Substream. Grayscale, As It Is, and other newer Fearless acts were finding hungry audiences. The concept that shouldn't have worked in 2000 was, 20 years later, still recruiting. Still doing exactly what Becker stumbled onto, taking something familiar and making it electric. And then came the anniversary, and with it, a reckoning. In 2024, Fearless Records turned 30. 3 decades since Bob Becker was selling records from a car. 30 years since he named a label after not knowing what he was doing. The Punk Goes series had crossed 2.5 million in cumulative album sales and was approaching 250 million streams. The roster had produced a Billboard #1, multiple Grammy nominations, and shaped multiple waves of alternative music. That's not a gimmick. That is a legacy. But 30 years forces a harder question. Fearless was built on reinvention, on trying absurd things, doubling down when they worked and pivoting when the world changed. Can a label built on constant motion sustain something as fixed as a legacy? The answer might already be written in the discography. Let's go back to the question that followed Punk Goes Pop since 2002. Was this a gimmick? A gimmick runs on novelty. It works once, twice, then the trick's visible and the magic's gone. Punk Goes Metal in 2000 could have been a gimmick. Punk Goes Pop in 2002 probably looked like one. But 81 million Spotify streams on Volume 4 and a pop-punk revival still finding Volume 7 relevant 20 years later, the word gimmick stopped fitting a long time ago. What Punk Goes actually was, and what Fearless built on top of it, was a philosophy. Accessibility doesn't require compromise. Taking a Backstreet Boys song and playing it through a Marshall stack at 140 BPM isn't a betrayal of punk. It's punk's oldest instinct. Take something that exists, make it yours, play it louder than anyone expected. Every band that found their first real audience through a compilation track. Every teenager who found Yellowcard because they recognized a Michelle Branch song. Every streaming listener who discovered a Fearless artist through an algorithm fed by a viral cover moment. That's the lineage. That's what it built. Fearless took a crazy idea and turned it into the top-selling compilation series in alternative music history. Not by being the loudest label in the room, but by being the most willing to look dumb, stay with what worked, and adapt when the world moved. 30 years later, somewhere right now, a kid who's never heard of post-hardcore just clicks a cover of a pop song they already knew, and their entire taste in music is about to change. Bob Becker would call that fearless. We'd love your comments below. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to like it and subscribe to our channel for more deep dives into your favorite bands and the stories behind them drop every week.